Welcome to the Closet Calvinist podcast. Some Christians have an inner Calvinist in them and don't even realize it. We will try to bring out the inner Calvinist that may be in you out of the closet. Here is your host, Mike G.
Welcome back to the Closet Calvinist podcast. This is bonus episode number 13. Recently, I came across a social media comment that said, because Calvinism is the doctrine of fate from the Gnostics. Now that's a serious accusation. The claim is that Calvinism did not come from Scripture but from Gnosticism, and that the Calvinist doctrine of election is nothing more than a form of fate. In this episode, I want to examine that claim and ask three questions. 1. What was Gnosticism? 2. Is Calvinism a doctrine of fate? And 3. Does Scripture teach God's sovereign election? All right, let's dive in. What was Gnosticism? Gnosticism was one of the earliest heresies to confront the Christian church. The word comes from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge. Gnostics taught that salvation came through the secret knowledge available to only a select few. They generally believed that the physical world was evil and that salvation consisted of escaping the material world through special enlightenment. The apostles strongly opposed these ideas. Christianity teaches that God created the material world and declared it good. Christianity teaches that Christ came in the flesh, and Christianity teaches salvation by grace through faith, not through secret knowledge. In fact, Gnosticism and biblical Christianity are fundamentally opposed to one another. Now, is Calvinism the same as fate? Well, the answer to that is clearly no. When people hear about election or predestination, they often think of fate, but fate and God's sovereignty are not the same thing. Fate is an impersonal force. Fate has no wisdom. Fate has no purpose. Fate has no love. Fate simply happens. The God of Scripture is personal. He acts according to his wisdom. He acts according to his holiness. He acts according to his perfect purpose. Paul writes in Ephesians 1, verse 11, according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the counsel of his will. Notice Paul doesn't say events occur according to fate. He says they occur according to God's will. There is a massive difference. Long before Calvin was born, Scripture taught that God is sovereign. Consider Isaiah 46, verses 9 and 10, which says, I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times things not yet done. Or how about Daniel 4, verse 35? He does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. Or in the words of Jesus himself, all that the Father gives to me will come to me. That's John 6, verse 37. These verses existed nearly 1,500 years before Calvin. The doctrines Calvinists believe are not based on Calvin's authority. They are based on Scripture. But what about election? The doctrine of election is found throughout the Bible. God chose Abraham. God chose Israel. God chose the apostles. And Scripture teaches that God chooses his people for salvation. In Ephesians 1, verse 4, Paul says, he chose us in him before the foundation of the world. Notice that Paul does not present election as pagan fate. He presents it in loving purpose of a gracious God. Election is personal. Election is intentional. Election is rooted in God's mercy. Sometimes critics argue that election was invented by Augustine or Calvin. But even before Augustine, many early Christian writers spoke of God's sovereignty, grace, and divine initiative in salvation. More importantly, our authority is not Augustine. Our authority is not Calvin. Our authority is Scripture. The question is not, what did Calvin teach? The question is, what does the Bible teach? And the Bible repeatedly teaches that salvation begins with God. Another misconception is that if God is sovereign, human choices do not matter. Yet Scripture teaches both. Joseph told his brothers in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. His brothers acted freely and were responsible, yet God was sovereign over the event. God consistently teaches both divine sovereignty and human responsibility. We may not fully comprehend how those truths fit together, but Scripture affirms them both. If someone wants to argue that Calvinism is wrong, that's a discussion worth having. Let's open our Bibles. Let's examine the texts. Let's study Scripture together. But simply saying Calvinism comes from Gnosticism or that it is merely fate does not address what Calvinists actually believe. The real question remains, what does Scripture teach about God's sovereignty, man's responsibility, and salvation? That's the conversation Christians should be having. The claim that Calvinism is the doctrine of fate from the Gnostics does not stand up to historical or biblical scrutiny. Gnosticism taught salvation through secret knowledge. Calvinism teaches salvation by God's grace through faith. Fate is an impersonal force. The God of Scripture is personal, wise, holy, and sovereign. And the doctrines of election and predestination are not rooted in pagan philosophy. They are rooted in the pages of Scripture itself. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Closet Calvinist podcast. May God richly bless your life. Grace and peace to you all.
Thank you for listening to the Closet Calvinist podcast. If you have any questions, then please contact us at our email, mikeg@theclosetcalvinist.com, or visit our website at www.theclosetcalvinist.com. The Closet Calvinist podcast is a production of the Calvinist Media Group.